Hi, I'm Wei-Chung, and I am an economist by training, but business practitioner by heart.
And I am Thakar, a designer by trade with a knack for marketing and an entrepreneurial spirit. And this is Crash and Build, the podcast where we talk about crashing old perceptions and building new perspectives in the realms of business, economics, marketing, tech, and more.
Here we introduce you to aha moments that will prompt new ideas. Listen in to stay on pace with our ever-changing world.
Politics, economics, and global trade. They're like a three-dimensional chess game where the rules keep changing. I'm Thakar.
And I'm Wei-Chung, India. That is actually a perfect analogy for what we're seeing right now, especially after the presidential election in the United States.
Absolutely. So, Wei-Chung, what are we going to crash and what are we going to build today?
You know what's fascinating? We're crashing this long-held belief that global trade is just about finding the cheapest place to make things, and I think we've seen some of that dynamics played out throughout the last decade. And we're trying to build something that I would like to call trade reality 2.0. And I think politics, economics, and businesses will collide in ways that'll make my old economics professor's head spin. And so let's do this.
Right. And I bet that those professors never had to deal with what businesses are facing right now. Because just last week, I was talking with a manufacturer that I know in Ohio. And she's been watching these policy proposals about 100% tariffs that have been talked about the last few weeks. And she's very concerned about them.
I don't think she's alone because I too have people in my network that constantly reach out and ask me the ramifications and implications of the proposed trade policy by President-elect Trump, and he's as he enters into his second term, people are extremely worried and concerned with the business reality and how they are going to respond. And let me share something that might help put her concerns in perspective, right? Because obviously, the Ohio manufacturer, like I said, she's not alone. Think about a cattle rancher faced with a new type of feed, and that feed potentially will increase the total weight of the herd by 20%, which is really all the rancher cares about because the ranchers sell meat by pounds. It all sounds great, but with the new type of feed, some cattle will get sick because they can't handle it. So if you only analyze it from the perspective of total weight gain, the total gain is huge. But if you try to tell that to the rancher, watch his sick cattle, I mean, people might think differently.
Right. And that's sort of like exactly what she was saying. She's been in business for almost three generations. She has sells state of the art equipment, and she's got everything that you'd want to see in American manufacturing. But here's what stuck with me. She said that her biggest competition is not other American companies anymore. It's the entire manufacturing ecosystem globally.
Well, tell me a little bit more about what she meant by that.
Right. Well, she was explaining that when her father ran the business before her, they competed on price and quality, typically against other American companies. But now she's competing against entire cities built around specific industries. And her competitors can get parts delivered in hours that take her weeks to source. So for her, it's not just about labor costs. It's more about speed, flexibility, convenience, having everything you need right at your doorstep, which, that seems like most of the problem with our society today.
Absolutely. You know what's fascinating about that? Her experiences actually perfectly captured this massive shift happening in global trade. It's like we've moved from a world of simple transactions to something more like a global palette where timing and coordination matter as much as cost.
Yeah. Yeah, like a ballet, exactly. That's a very interesting way to put it, but that's true. With these new policy proposals coming, isn't it almost more like a mosh pit rather than a ballet?
Maybe more like a tango, perhaps. It actually takes two to make it work, right? But sometimes you're moving forward, sometimes backward. Look at what happened with smartphones. We have companies try moving production around, but they quickly discover something surprising.
What was that?
They found out that making a phone isn't just about assembly; it's about having the right ecosystem, right? And Apple recently just moved their manufacturing activities of iPhones to Tamil Nadu, a province in India. And Apple doesn't just pick the location randomly. Apple chose it because the region has been making phones for decades. They've got the combination of skilled workers, the supplier networks, everything you need. So really, it's the ecosystem that people are looking for, not just the cheap labor or just
Mm,
several parts. It's the whole system.
right. Okay. But doesn't that make us vulnerable? I mean, we saw what happened during 2020, during kind of the height of COVID, when we couldn't get the right medical supplies that we needed.
That is the eternal trade-off question, and I think economists overly emphasize on the trade benefit without
Mm,
focusing a little bit on the national security issue or kind of like the strategic impact behind free trade that economists propose. And I'm an economist. I can understand that perspective. And I think that's correct. I mean, if you only analyze it from the welfare and benefit perspectives, obviously with the goal of maximizing total gain, that makes sense. Free trade makes sense. But strategically, if you consider also national security, then things become a little bit more complex. And so it's like
mm,
asking whether you should have one really good friend or lots of casual acquaintances. The answer is it really depends on what you need.
mm. Yeah, that is interesting, and it reminds me of something else that my friend told me, my manufacturer friend. She said that they are now actually working with competitors on certain projects.
That is very interesting, and I'll tell you, like a lot of people don't even realize that. For example, like iPhones and the Android
Mhm.
phones made by Samsung, right? So clearly, Apple and Samsung are competitors, but also Apple is using the Samsung displays on its iPhones, so they're like frenemies. And so it
Mhm.
may be very similar to what your friend has told you. Would you mind telling me and the audience a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so she called it co-opetition, which I mean, if you can understand, it's cooperation with competition. So her and her competitors will compete on finished projects, but they'll also cooperate on supply chain issues. And they've realized that it's better to have a reliable supply chain network than to have to worry about giving away small advantages to their other competitors.
Yeah, I mean, based on the phone example that I just gave you, I mean, I'm witnessing similar situations in other industries as well. I mean, for example, take
Mm,
semiconductor industry as an example. Companies that used to guard their secrets are now forming alliances. They are all sharing resources. It's like they've realized
mm,
this bigger threat isn't their traditional competitors. It's being left behind by the entire region that work together, right? So they're worried and concerned, but their way to cope with the challenge is to really huddle together and try to become an ecological system that relies upon each other.
mm. Right. And speaking of being left behind, Wei-Chung, let's talk about what this means for jobs because a lot of our listeners are probably wondering about that.
Yeah, I mean, see, jobs are what people talk about, and including the president-elect Trump. I mean, when he was running his campaign, he promised to bring back jobs to American people. And so the interesting thing about job is that the story isn't what most people think. Now, think about your Ohio manufacturer friend. I bet she's not looking for the same kind of workers that her father was hiring.
No, no, probably not. Actually, that's exactly what she said. She said that they're desperate for people who can understand automation, who can work with international suppliers, and who can handle complex logistics.
And that's exactly the key point that everybody needs to understand. The jobs aren't disappearing, they're just transforming. And I think that is also perfectly predicted by economic theories. It's like what happened with bank tellers after ATMs were introduced. Everyone thought ATMs would eliminate teller jobs, but instead,
Mm,
banks opened more branches and tellers became relationship managers.
right. But aren't some jobs truly disappearing? I mean, especially with all of the new tariffs that will be put in place.
And I think you hit the nail on the head. Here's what's fascinating about that: tariffs um, or protective trade measures often protect jobs that are already transforming. So let me share something that I saw in South Korea that completely changed how I think about this.
Oh, what happened there?
So remember, I mean, if I may pull you back to in time, right? Back in the 1980s, everybody told South Korea to stick to agriculture, including
Mm,
the World Bank, the IMF, mainly the World Bank, um, because we were trying to help South Korea identify their competitive advantage and comparative advantage. But instead, they decided to build an auto industry. And everyone at the time in the 80s said that they were crazy. No one would actually buy Korean cars, they said.
mm.
Fast forward to today, companies like Hyundai and Kia are leading the electric vehicle revolution.
Right. Actually, I own a Kia. So what is the lesson there?
So I think the lesson here, like people need to hear it, but it's really tough to swallow. The lesson isn't about protecting or not protecting industries. It's about adapting. South Korea didn't succeed because they protected their auto industry. They succeeded because they transformed it. They didn't try to make cheaper versions of American cars. They invested in completely new technologies.
Mm, okay. So my friend, my manufacturer friend, she actually said something similar. She told me that they're not trying to compete with China on price, but now they're competing on speed and innovation.
And I think that's exactly where smart companies are focusing. And here's what makes the current situation so complex: we're seeing changes that usually take decades happening in just a few years.
Oh, really? Like what?
If you take a look at the auto industry in Mexico, they have spent 60 years building their manufacturing ecosystem. Now they have
Mm,
more free trade agreements than any other country in the world. You can't replicate that overnight, no matter how high you make tariffs.
okay. So what are companies doing to adapt?
I've seen a lot of smart ones, right? So the smart companies are
Mhm.
playing what I call the long game and the short game. They played both games simultaneously. So in the short term, they're creating backup plans for their supply chain. But for long term, they're completely rethinking how they operate.
Okay. Do you have an example?
Take a look at Tesla. Everybody loves talking about Tesla because Tesla is such a gigantic company that has grabbed everybody's attention in recent years. Everyone
Mm,
thinks of Tesla as a car company, but they're really a technology company that happens to make cars. And if you try to understand their whole supply chain, they source parts from over 200 suppliers across 30 different countries. They're not trying to bring all the production to one place. They're building flexible networks that can adapt when conditions change.
and that is smart, but can smaller companies that don't have the resources like Tesla, can they also do that?
And I think that's what gets interesting. And people always think, oh, you know what? It's because Tesla can do everything that it wants now. It's so big, it's
Mm,
gigantic, it's all has all the attention from the investing public and resources. And but remember, your Ohio manufacturer friend and their frenemy or co-petition strategy that she mentioned. Smaller companies, they're forming networks, they're sharing resources, so they're trying to create their own ecosystem, and they may not be able to do that single-handedly, but if they gather together and they huddle, at least that's what they're trying to do. And as you can see, like smaller ecosystems are being formed in various pockets across the United States, especially the United States, because
Mhm.
things are more expensive here, and I think you have to, if you are kind of like a manufacturer, you really have to do things strategically to keep your competitive edge. And I think your friend is doing exactly that.
Yeah, right. I think she has been. And something that I've seen is I've also seen this done in the tech sector as well. Smaller companies have been banding together in somewhat to share supplier networks, logistics, and even talent pools.
Right. So I think in today's world, people started discovering, and businesses started discovering, that ecosystem is probably more important and more powerful than any individual company. But we have seen that in the past. I mean, take a look at Silicon Valley. I mean, Silicon Valley, it's
Mm,
its own ecosystem, right? It's like
right,
the
right,
startup hub in the tech
right.
industry. If you want to have a successful startup in tech, your best bet is to move your operation to Silicon Valley to start, and that's an
Mm.
ecosystem concept.
No, absolutely. And do you have any insight on how startups in Silicon Valley are going to be handling this?
Yeah. So now I want to add that tech industry is not immune to trade issues. Right. So remember a few years back when we had the semiconductor chip shortage, and suddenly
Mhm.
every tech CEO became an expert on supply chains.
Yeah, I do. I remember reading about car companies having to shut down production. And also, I was actually myself, I was working at a car dealership at that time. And I remember, just having so many cars not in the lot. The lots were just empty because, you know, there was a shortage and people couldn't get enough chips to make more.
Right. So I enjoy watching this movie, and there was a movie called, was it called Butterfly Effect?
There is a movie called Butterfly Effect. I haven't seen
Right.
it
So
though,
like
and it's supposed to be
like a
good.
small, exactly, like a small little tiny change in one part of the world could create this rippling effect throughout the entire
Mm.
system, and that's what we're seeing right now. Like, and I think the chip shortage and the supply chain disruption during COVID taught everyone a crucial lesson, because in today's economy, everything is connected. You can't even separate the physical world from the digital world anymore. And a policy change
Mhm.
in one area will ripple through the entire system, like I mentioned, and which is why I think everybody has been paying attention to the presidential election that recently took place in the United States, and they were trying to adapt. They
Mhm.
were trying to see, how a new government in the United States and what kind of impact it'll create.
Right. And you just touched on something really important there with the butterfly effect, in that this idea is that everything really is connected. And I'm thinking about all of our listeners who are trying to run their own businesses or manage their careers in this sort of environment. What should they be on the lookout for?
That's an excellent question. And I think that's also in line with a lot of questions that I receive on a daily basis from my friends and students. Because most people are watching the headlines about tariffs and trade policies, and
Mhm.
they often think that, oh, you know what, that's at the macro level, right? The macro narratives shouldn't affect how I conduct my daily business. But I think people who are reading the headlines are missing the bigger shifts happening underneath. It's like watching the waves on the ocean while missing the currents below. And I think, again,
Mhm.
that's something that needs to be addressed.
Right. No, absolutely. And what kind, like with that metaphor that you just gave, what kind of currents are we talking about?
And I'm not sure whether you've heard this thing called rare earth metal. So rare earth metals are
Hmm.
they are called rare earth
I
metals,
took
but they're
chemistry.
actually, right, but they're actually not rare. It's right, and but I think people didn't realize how important rare earth metals were until a decade and decade and a half ago, when uh, you know the world started relying on China to supply majority of the rare earth metals. Now, so I'll
Mhm.
give you the quick rundown of the story. So it's not like U.S. doesn't have rare earth metals. We do, but really to get the rare earth metals out is an extremely contaminating practice that'll damage the environment. And because of
Mhm.
the regulations, obviously you can imagine that U.S. had to bend it, right? And China took that as a potential opportunity. So they started really mining the rare earth elements and refining them, and then became the leading supplier in rare earth metals. So take a look at the
Mhm.
purposes of rare earth metals. I mean, just some quick example, like the thing, the phones that you're using, the vibrating part, that's a rare earth
Mhm.
metal. If you take a look at, for example, like an F 35, the fighter jet that U.S. is so proud that we could make,
Mhm.
has more than
Mhm.
1 ton of rare earth elements. So most
Wow.
people have never heard of them, but they're literally in everything. Like I said, I mean, your phones, your electric cars, wind turbines, and for
Mhm.
years, everyone was fine with having 90% of the processing done in one region, in China,
Mhm.
right? Now, companies are now scrambling to build new supply chains, but
Now,
it's so
can
difficult because you can't just overnight rebuild the whole thing.
right, like how can you create a new supply chain for something even that rare and that complex?
And that is the $1 million question. Um, so if watch the documentary by 60 Minutes, right? So they actually,
Mhm.
so there was in one episode, you could Google it, and they actually take the audience to visit kind of like the rare earth metal processing facility. The complexity is mind-boggling. It's not just about having the raw materials; it's about having the expertise, the infrastructure, the environmental controls. You can't just recreate all that overnight, right? And
Right.
I'm not here to comment the differences between environmental protection standards in China and the United States, which partially explain why China could build that industry.
I
But
assumed. I
but it is the
assumed.
reality. Yeah, it is the reality now that they have the rare earth elements.
Right. But with these new tariffs and these new policy changes, isn't that kind of like recreating this supply chain? Isn't that exactly what some companies might have to do?
So I think the companies right now are realizing that they need to solve two different problems simultaneously, right? Not only they have to deal
Mm.
with the immediate policy changes, but they're also trying to figure out what the world looks like 5, 10 years from now, right? And I
Right.
think that recently there was a new term that has been throwing around. It's called decoupling, right? So as the U.S.
Mm.
China relationship becomes more fragile, if you will, people are trying to imagine, what the world would look like if we can't conduct business with a specific country.
Mm.
And I think, in a sense, we're already experimenting that, because there were some countries that have been deemed as enemies by the United States. Like, for example, U.S. not
Right.
only will not be willing to do business with Russia because we deem Russia as an enemy, we also stop our friends from conducting business with Russia. So the decoupling oftentimes uh, refer to just two countries not doing business together. But now we have political reality being played out in the world that we have to pay attention to. How the political landscape has shifted, right? So it's more complex.
Right. And when they look, so you're, I'm guessing, are you referring to when we're talking about this, do you think, like based off of what has been said in politics and by you know, the newly elected President Trump, like, do you think that do you think that global supply chain processes with China is going to be the biggest issue?
So
Because that's what he
it'll be a
has said, right?
that's right. I think it'll be a
Okay.
big issue to start, right? But I think that the trade conversations will permeate through the political relationships that U.S. has with other countries. And think
Okay.
about what happened with his first term, right? And
Mhm.
he he promised that he was going to bring the jobs back to American people, and he's going to continue doing that, right? So the
Right,
question that
right.
I have with for the listeners would be, are the jobs coming back, or have the jobs come back, right? So
Mhm.
the fact of the matter is, like, you see a lot of movement in how businesses change their locations, and a lot of
Mhm.
businesses have moved away from China because of the policy enacted during President Trump's first term. But
Mhm.
where did the factories go? Where did the factories move to? Right, not necessarily back to America. Instead, we
Right.
have other countries that have become the destinations for the businesses. So I think businesses are trying to be adaptive, but and one thing that business people hate is the uncertainty, right? And they want to
Right.
keep the guessing game to the minimum, but sometimes political reality doesn't allow them to do that.
Hmm. So when we look like say 5 to 10 years in the future, what are we seeing?
I think what I could predict is that businesses will refuse to put all the eggs in one basket. They're
Mhm.
looking for they're obviously looking for efficiency, and they will continue looking for
Mhm.
efficiency because that affects their bottom line. But I think
Mhm.
more businesses are focusing on sustainability and resilience, right? And
Mhm.
I can see that because of the political reality, that more businesses are finally catching up to that wisdom, right?
Mhm. So not putting all their eggs in one basket. Do you mean like diversifying?
Absolutely. So look at what Apple's doing. Everyone talks about Apple moving some production to India, but they're not just moving
Mhm.
production. They're actually creating entire new ecosystems. They're working with local suppliers. They're training workers. They're building infrastructure. And obviously, from the perspective of
Mhm.
India, that's welcoming.
Right. But wow, that sounds expensive.
It is going to be expensive, but companies are finding that cost of not doing it is probably even higher.
I
And
see.
it's like buying insurance, right? So nobody likes paying for it, but you really don't like not having it when you need it.
Right. Yeah. But so what does this mean for smaller businesses? I mean, they don't have the resources to build new ecosystems.
They can join them, right? Remember your Ohio
Mhm.
friend who's a manufacturer? She's already part of what I call the new manufacturing networks. These aren't
Mm.
just supply chains anymore. They're knowledge networks, innovation networks. They share resources with one another, even with their competitors.
Mm. And, another thing that she told me is that one of her biggest challenges isn't finding new suppliers or even trying to deal with these tariffs, but rather it's finding people who understand how to work in this new environment of complex ecosystems.
And that is exactly where the real story is, right? The jobs that really matter now are the ones that connect different parts of this all these different types of networks. Think about it. We're not
Mm.
just trading goods anymore. We're trading knowledge, expertise, and innovation, right? So
Mm.
when we talk about trade, we often think about like tangible products. Not necessarily true. I mean, the highest value add industries in the United States are actually service industries. So technical know-how, knowledge, patents, technology are the ones that create the most value. And I think some of
Mm.
the even the most traditional manufacturers here in the United States are are finally understanding that.
And that's not anything that any type of trade policy can control.
You know what? It actually reminds me of how my old economic textbooks talked about trade. Right? They made it sound so simple.
Right.
This country makes this, that country makes that. Everybody trades and gets richer. But it's unfortunately not that simple.
No, no, absolutely not. And I'm guessing real life isn't that simple at all.
Yeah. Well, guess what? I mean, think about like ordering coffee at Starbucks. It's no longer
Mm,
just paying cash in exchange of the good, right? There's so many things involved. There is online app. There is kiosks that exist in McDonald's, maybe not Starbucks, but perhaps soon enough, right? So
mhm.
global trade has gone just as complex because you have all these different elements trying to better the business practice.
Right. And so what could be the equivalent of just a simple black Americano?
That's actually a great question. I'll tell you. So the simple trade relationships. I'll sell you this. You'll sell me that. That's becoming really rare. Now it's
Mm.
becoming more like, well, imagine a global potluck dinner where everyone brings ingredients, but the dishes get cooked in multiple kitchens.
And okay. And now so someone is changing the rules about which ingredients can come from where.
Exactly, and I'll tell. So here's what makes it really interesting. The best chefs aren't worried about getting specific ingredients from specific places anymore because the chefs
Mm.
are building relationships with multiple suppliers, creating new recipes, and they're adapting.
So is this like your China plus one strategy?
It's kind of evolving beyond that, right? Because smart companies aren't just looking for plan B anymore. They're creating entirely new ways of operating. It's perhaps not China plus one, it's network plus innovation.
Okay. Could you break that down a little bit for our listeners?
So think about the rare earth example that we previously discussed, right? So companies used to think, all right, so where can we get these materials cheapest? Now they're asking, how can we create systems that work no matter what happens to a single supplier? Are there alternatives?
And that sounds like a fundamental shift in how business works entirely.
It really is. And you know what's fascinating? I think this shift was happening anyway. And recent policy changes aren't causing it, they're just accelerating it.
Mm. So, so where does this leave us, and what should our listeners really take away from all of this?
Look, policy changes will come and go, right? And I think what has changed more significantly in the past 5 years was COVID, right? So COVID kind of pushed everybody to understand now there is a new reality, right? So the supply chain disruption, the mask shortage. Remember, like those things,
Mhm.
we got reminded constantly uh, during COVID, and
Mhm.
and and the policy changes are just one part of it. It just happens so that for example, uh, we had President Trump and his first term, and he was proposing these anti-trade free trade policies, and that coupled with what happened with COVID kind of accelerated everything. Different administrations will have different priorities, but underneath all that, there is a deeper transformation happening in how global business works.
And that deeper transformation is,
So we're right now moving from a world of linear supply chains to one of resilient networks. So from efficiency at all costs to efficiency plus security, and then also from only competing on cost to competing on adaptability.
okay, so efficiency plus security, and from competing on cost to competing on adaptability. That sounds really great in theory, but what about the overall cost? Won't this make everything a bit more expensive?
Oh, for sure. Initially, probably, right? But remember the
Mhm.
cattle rancher story we started with? Sometimes you have to look beyond the immediate cost to see the bigger picture.
Okay, and what is that bigger picture telling us?
And I think that bigger picture is about, the fact that the real cost isn't in adapting to change. It's in trying to
Mm.
prevent it. Every company that's thriving today, from your Ohio manufacturer example to global tech giants, they're not just reacting to change, they're anticipating it and they're planning for it and they're using it to their own advantage. So there is indeed a first mover advantage in this. So people like businesses as well as individuals that understand and realize, what we just talked about, forming ecosystem, trying to participate in this new reality, trying to understand international trade from this, frenemy perspective, they will win out
Mm.
because they are adapting to it. And this goes beyond to beyond who the United States president is.
Okay. So Wei-Chung, like depending on, we've got a lot of listeners from different places. So whether they own a large company, whether they own a small business, whether they are looking for a career shift, what is your biggest piece of advice to the people who are listening to this episode right now?
So I'm going to give you a piece of advice that is going to sound cliche in the traditional Harvard Business Review, like strategy handbook or article. I think the
Mhm.
key is adaptability, right? Don't get caught up with the macro narratives. If you get caught up in the day-to-day noise about policies and politics, you forget that, as a business, you have to be constantly strategizing, right? And the winners in the new environment won't be the biggest or the strongest. They will be the most adaptable, and I think that's the key.
So adaptability is the key.
Absolutely.
I think that is a perfect place to wrap up. We started by asking what we're crashing and building, and it turns out we are crashing old ways of thinking about trade and building new, more resilient approaches to business, which seems like it focuses around adaptability.
And remember, in times of change, the biggest risk isn't in moving too fast; it's in standing still.
All right. That is all for this episode of Crash and Build. As always, we'll post any relevant links and resources on our website and in the show notes. And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep adapting.
Thank you for tuning in. Bye bye.
Crash and Build is hosted by Wei-Chung Wang and co-hosted and produced by India Thakar. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Crash and Build.